Hi, everyone. It's Cristina Tzintzún Ramirez. I'm the president of NextGen America, and we are the country's largest youth voting rights organization. And we are super excited for this live stream to talk about the power of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, the AAPI community. We know that to get young people out to vote, we have to make sure that the AAPI community is also fully represented, given the voice and power that they deserve. And so we're excited about this panel that we have. I live in Texas, where we have one of the largest and fastest growing AAPI communities. Houston is home to one of the country's largest Vietnamese populations and South Asian communities. So I'm particularly excited about this conversation. And of course, we've seen a record-breaking turnout from the Asian American community in 2016, 2018, and 2020, and we are hoping for a record-breaking turnout again. So I'm really excited to introduce our panel. We have three incredible powerhouses, or as I like to say in Spanish, chingones y chingonas, which means fucking amazing people that do brilliant work in their communities. So we have Vivian Chang, who is the Civic Engagement and Racial Justice Director at the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, overseeing all of their programs on voting, redistricting, immigration advocacy, and political power. And I'm also really excited because she doesn't know this, but she's also a Buckeye, which means she comes from Columbus, Ohio. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. My mom lives on Indianola Avenue, which is right by OSU. So just a connection and warm love from another Ohioan. I don't know if I call myself a Buckeye, though. But,
Love that.
So thanks for being here with us, and excited to learn more about the work that you do that changes and makes sure that our democracy is more representative. And we also have Michael Wynn, who is the Associate Manager of Policy and Advocacy at the Asian Pacific American Advocates, and he leads the work there for civil rights and national policy and advocacy efforts to educate and advocate on the issues that matter to the AAPI community. So excited to have you as well, Michael, with us. And last but not least, we also have Joy de Guzman, who is the Manager of Community Engagement at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, where she helps develop and conduct community outreach, public education campaigns, and mobilizations to advance policy objectives for the organization and make sure the AAPI community gets the power and respect that they deserve. So thank you all so much for being here. I super appreciate you all making the time, especially because it's so close to an election and there's so much to be doing in our communities. But before we get started, I come from the Latino community, and we're always saying, like, we're not a monolith. We're not a monolith. We're super diverse. And then I think of the AAPI community and I'm like, no, that's a super diverse population. So I would love to just start off, like, I think our culture is what makes this country so amazing, is just like all of our cultures coming together. And I would love, before we start, to just tell us a little bit about what you do and your organization does. And then the thing about your own culture that you just love, like if it's food or if it's family, whatever it is that you really just like love about your own culture. So we'll start with Vivian.
Sure, thank you. And now I'm like, well, being a Buckeye is part of our culture too. So I love that. But yeah, great to meet everyone. So excited for folks tuning in. My name is Vivian Chang. I use she, her pronouns. And my parents are both from Taiwan. So they came here as students. And I don't know. I mean, I think food, obviously a big one people always pick out. Something I can never find is like tomato egg rice, which is like a really home style Taiwanese food. So that's something like every time I go home, I'm like, can we have that? But I think also like just a really strong spirit of democracy in Taiwan. Like it's a country that's lived under martial law. It was a country that has been colonized. And so I feel like I'm always like carrying forward like that spirit, even though sometimes my parents are like a little fearful about like, how do we engage, right? I'm like, we have to build this, right? You've lived in one country and had to kind of fight against a lot of different oppressions. Like now we're here and we're still fighting. So yeah.
Awesome. Enjoy.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to kind of be with Vivian and Michael as well. I haven't seen you all in a minute. My name is Joy. I'm with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. I am what I identify as a 1.5 Filipino American. My parents immigrated here, but I lived in the Philippines for a little bit as well. You always have to shout out the food. The food is great. But there is a word in Tagalog, and it's called, it says, Gaya Banihan. My Tagalog isn't that great, but it means like community. So this sense of community and responsibility with your community and helping each other out is a value that I think is really strong in my experience with Filipino culture, and I kind of really love that about my culture and my family. I think it's exemplified well.
And Michael.
Hi, everyone. Again, thank you also for having me here. I'm with OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates. Pronouns are he, him. Let's see. So I'm Vietnamese. My parents fled after the Vietnam War, and they were part of the second wave of boat people. So interesting story is that my mom actually fled when she was 6 months pregnant with me. And the boat miraculously landed in Malaysia, where I was born in a refugee camp. And so when I think about my culture and my community, my heritage, I'm just, first of all, extremely grateful, to be, in the U.S. I grew up in Santa Clara, California, next to San Jose, which is the second largest Vietnamese community in the U.S. And similar to what others have talked about, I think what I appreciate about sort of my culture and community is the resiliency within my community, and of course, like the food. My favorite is vermicelli, egg rolls, and pork. And this Vietnamese, I don't know if folks know, but it's like a sweet and sour hot soup that's incredible. Every time I go home, my mom cooks it for me. So some of the thoughts.
Okay, we were just talking before this started about what we had for breakfast, but now you all made me very hungry. So but we'll get started. So I would love, before we just jump in and learn more about your work, and maybe you can answer this through this question, is, how did you all get involved in this work, right? Because I think a lot of us, all four of us are tied to like an immigrant experience in some way. And I know my parents were like, what is this job you do? And so how did you get involved in this work? And then, what is the real mission of your organization? And we can just go in the order that we started earlier.
Sure. I think it's kind of funny because I've somehow fell into this work. I've always done things that were social justice related even before I knew that was a term. So I always tell folks I studied physics in college and I thought that was my path, and then realized, oh, there's a world of nonprofits, there's a world of labor, there's all this. And I think I was that's where my heart really belongs. So I think for me, it's always been what does it feel right? Where do I see my impact being made? And specifically, electorally, my first campaign was working in the 2018 elections, in the midterm. So I worked on a Nevada Senate campaign, and AAPI is we bridge labor and API worlds, and so we've always known that to build worker power, we need political power, and vice versa. So I think it was just really exciting to be there. But also it's funny because my mom works for the state government of Ohio, and so she's been a union member, but she never talked about it until I started working at AAPI. And now I'm wow, we could have had these conversations for years.
I think for me, at a really young age, I understood that kind of the resources that you had was really dependent on the area that you lived in, to the schools that you went to. So when I was really young, my parents actually used a different address to get me into what they perceived to be a safer school district. And I think growing up, I understood that socioeconomic standing kind of decided what your opportunities were. And I really thought that was unfair. So I kind of, growing up, tried to learn more about socioeconomic inequality. And then I understood how race and ethnicity and opportunity and immigration status, right, and documentation kind of played a role in the opportunities that we got. So I was really passionate about addressing a lot of those inequalities. And I think that's what we try to do at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. And we do that through fighting for civil and human rights for everyone. As an organization, we always say we serve the American population. We don't try to speak for the Pacific Islander population because we can't necessarily speak to those experiences. But we try to work on immigration, on voting rights, on education, to try to create a more fair world that tries to eliminate those inequalities, right? And we do that by working with community partners all around the country, and advocating federally and supporting grassroots movements as well.
For me, growing up, I've always been very active in sort of community service, public service work, advocacy work. And after I went to law school, I actually worked as a prosecutor for about 5-6 years. And for me, doing that work was incredible, getting to represent the community, getting to represent crime victims, right? And while I worked as a prosecutor, I was also really involved with the Asian American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division, doing a lot of diversity and inclusion work. And so I've always done sort of the advocacy work, and the chance to come to OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, was an opportunity to work on a national scale on so many important issues, right? Our policy portfolio includes, working on issues of education, immigration, civic engagement, racial equity, inclusion, which includes a lot of the anti-Asian work, as well as tech and telecoms. And so for me, it's super exciting and really a chance to just really make a big impact at the national scale.
Well, I wanted to know, a lot of folks, right, this may be the first time they've been on a live stream talking about the work that you all do. And so what are the most important issues that you see impacting, right, this huge community, but impacting the AAPI community as far as in civil rights and voting rights? Like, what are the main things that people come up against in your community?
Yeah, I can go again. I think what's interesting, because I was like, we can all cover different things, but particularly for API workers, which is our base for APALA, wage theft, minimum wage not being enough. There's so many class issues that never get talked about. And I think that a lot of that is tied up with a model minority myth, assumptions that our community, our folks who are, Asian American, Pacific Islander, folks who are Southeast Asian, South Asian, all the multiplicities within that, there's a lot of assumptions that our folks are well off, well educated, can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So a lot of the challenges that people face is not only such things like worker exploitation, their wages being stolen or not being compensated, but on top of that, lack of recognition of these issues. So lower enforcement for folks who are, facing these issues or facing harassment in the workplace, even just like lower access to, government agencies because of language barriers. So those are just like some specific issues I want to lift up for our labor audience.
Yeah. And I think to explain so I worked 10 years at a worker center helping people with wage theft. I think a lot of people don't understand how rampant this problem is, especially in immigrant communities where people go and work. They'll go and work at a restaurant or a construction site, and they'll work sometimes they're being paid below minimum wage. You find people making like $2, $1 an hour, working 80 hours a week. And I know that sounds like crazy that even happens, but also people just working. And then at the end of that time period, you will find businesses that just don't pay people at all. And it's super rampant. And you're right, like the barriers of contacting state agencies or the Department of Labor, and not having someone that speaks your language or understands your culture and community. And so huge issues. I just wanted to lift that up because sometimes people need to understand how rampant it is and just like how exploitive it is.
Totally.
Joy?
Yeah, so definitely everything that Vivian just said. At Advancing Justice, AAJC, we kind of also focus on language access, right? Do folks have the resources and the information to go cast their ballot in other languages that they need? We work with our community partners across the country to create materials in other languages and to help them advocate locally as well. Another big issue that I think pops up in voting, but also in other areas, is also just mis and disinformation. To be able to cast a ballot, but also cast an informed ballot, right? It's something that we work on at Advancing Justice at AAJC. There's mis and disinformation being spread online, but also in specific communities like WeChat and Kakao, where there are specific members of the Asian American and Asian community where there's mis and disinformation being spread. The other thing that we work on at Advancing Justice at AJC with our community partners is just litigation. I believe there are over 200 bills in different states that are attacking voting rights, whether that's line warming, whether that's requiring identification, different state bills that are trying to be passed that are trying to limit our community's right to vote. And one way that we try to do that is that we work with our community partners to bring up litigation and advance our community's rights to vote, or to kind of fend off those attacks on our rights.
And can you explain a little bit like the importance of being able to get a ballot in your own language? And then I know that those are like battles you have to fight county by county. And how do you guys do, like, how do you do that? And if you're in a local, like, you know, we had our Vietnamese population in Texas went up a lot in Dallas since they were able to finally get ballots in Vietnamese. But like, can you explain that to people that don't understand that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that comes like there are multiple ways that we do that, and that's why our work with our folks on the ground, community partners in states like Arizona and Nevada, play a really pivotal role in that, right? So once areas have a certain, like you said, like a Vietnamese community potentially in Texas, reach a certain number, the state is required to provide language assistance, and that's not just, and it can vary from resources. What do you need to vote, but also the ballot itself. And potentially that also means diversifying the folks that you have in your election office, right? Is there someone in your town to talk to people in language that can answer questions in language? Like, can there be, are there translators at the polls day of, right? Is someone saying, no, you can't bring your child to translate for you, right? All of these things that happen on election day but are happening right now are things that we're fighting for with our community partners.
Yeah, I think what you just said is so important to it, because we've also seen this passage of these voting restriction laws that say people can't help you cast your ballot, but if you don't speak, if your language is not available in the ballot, you literally have to have a family member. And so it's also putting people at fear of voting, which is just another barrier. And Michael, I know you address a lot of these different issues. I'd love to just hear kind of the big things that you guys face in your work.
Yeah, I think what Joy just talked about in terms of, you know, making, translating and having things in language is so important. So we also work with community partners in that. But I would say just there's a lot of apathy out there, right? And just getting people just motivated and understanding the importance of your vote. And so, you know, with OCA, we have chapters across the country. And so what we try to do is really mobilize our chapters to get out the vote, to really engage at the community level. And so we have, you know, various events set up to really get community members out there to vote.
So I think, you know, Vivian, you just talked about this a second ago about the misconceptions like that you're trying to break about the model minority myth, right? But what are the other, and even if you want to expand on that too, what are the real misconceptions that you all have to grapple with that you think it's really important for people to know the facts, the truth about your all's community?
Yeah, I love that question. Especially your preface around like so many communities that are considered monolithic or that are just collapsed into one word. Like, you know, even already within AAPI, that's collapsing huge like language families, different, you know, hundreds of countries of origin. So like one big misconception that we face a lot when we talk about economic justice issues is what I said, like the huge gaps in economic equality. So Asian Americans specifically, we are overrepresented in both high income and low income jobs. Like, so there's, you know, the stereotype of folks in tech, but then there's tons of folks who are working under the table, do domestic work, nail salon work, you know, restaurant work. A lot of that is really rife with wage theft because it's based on the cash economy. There's a lot of exploitative bosses. And then if you add in Pacific Islander folks, like there's huge economic inequality there as well. And then I was like, not even to add in the like histories and continuing colonization of folks that cause our home countries to be, you know, really like suffering and really kind of at a loss compared to that. And I think there's a lot of other misconceptions around the fact that like our communities are seen as silent, as like not taking action. But something that I've really enjoyed both in the civic engagement space and at AAPI is like always finding those people who do want to speak up. Like, we're loud. Sometimes people are like, who are those like people who are coming in here, right? And that's us. That's like AAPI workers, AAPI union members who really believe that we should have a voice and we should have like dignity on the job. And so I think a lot of times like we hear these misconceptions and the goal is to silence us, like is to make us not believe that we have our own power. And I think too, like there's a lot of misconceptions just around the fact that API workers or API working families, like we all face challenges the same way. Like, again, so many times we're told that like, you know, we don't have to care about economic issues. We don't have to care about X issue because we're set, you know, like we're high income, et cetera. And a lot of, none of that's true. And even like folks in like certain industries such as tech, we see like there are still people unionizing because they know like they have more power when they do that and that they lack it currently. So I think something that we're always trying to dismantle in the labor movement is this belief that like, you know, certain people don't need a union or unions are only for certain types of workers. Like that's hugely not true. And we know that like voting power, electoral power goes hand in hand with like worker power and people just having, you know, better access to economic power as well.
Joy, did you want to jump in?
I think Vivian talked about that really well. I think one thing that I want to highlight, right, this assumption that Asian Americans and Asians are doing well really financially, that, you know, we all speak English, like this allows many of our communities to be ignored and to not have the proper resources to address the issues that folks live with every day. And I think that's one of the major harms of the model minority myth. It also allows us, our communities, to sometimes be used as wedges against other communities of color and the Black community. So I think the model minority myth is extremely harmful, and we see it used in different issues across the board.
And I'll just briefly add too, you know, there's this bamboo ceiling idea, right? This stereotype that, you know, just as others talked about, like the Asian Americans are not effective leaders, that we're not fit to be in leadership positions, right? We do not make good managers. And if you actually look at the distribution in tech, where we think that there are a lot of Asians, very few are actually in leadership and management positions. But, you know, it's important to understand that leadership comes in many different forms, right? And it's impossible to attribute a single character trait, right? Whether it's positive or negative, to an entire racial group. And so I think that is a harmful stereotype. And it's important to, you know, to recognize that diversity in leadership positions should be celebrated and encouraged, right? Because it leads to innovative ideas and increased representation.
So I wanted to ask you all about the real challenges also post-COVID, right? That there have been these assaults, these attacks on the Asian American community across the country, really uptick in violent crimes and people being targeted, feeling targeted. And I wanted to know how that's changed your work. How have you all been responding? And also, how have you been working to capture that grief, that pain, and channel it into action for the community?
Yeah, I can start again. So early on, like literally early 2020, you know, before like the first case had shown up in the US, for Apollo, we were talking about it because we already saw like, you know, a lot of, especially like businesses in you know, Chinatowns and historic areas like that were, you know, seeing less like a declining customer base, or we'd already heard reports of workers who were facing, you know, for example, nurses who are getting patients who said, I don't want that nurse. I don't want the Asian nurse, you know? And so we were like, something's coming. Turns out it was, you know, the entire pandemic and, you know, the additional pandemic of anti-Asian hate. And so for us, it was, you know, starting really early and putting out guidance to unions, to like any kind of worker-centric organizing, to understand that like this was coming. So we had like guidance against like fighting xenophobia and fighting COVID, and how to be, you know, both like an ally to API folks in the workplace, and also for API folks to understand like what are the different ways that we can, resource this ourselves. So like recognizing, what people might call a microaggression that now I think we can more clearly call like, racist attacks or just generally discrimination against folks. So a lot of that was like that early education piece, I think, like raising awareness ahead of time, because so often, unfortunately, we have to be reactive. And it's like, an elder is harmed, and then how do we address that? So we've always understood in Apollo, like we need to start early. We need to like be out there, because once certain narratives are out there, we just talked about misconceptions. Like there's a lot that just like fly really quickly, and once that's out there, it's so much harder to, be unified and educate folks on like what these issues are. And then COVID itself, like, a lot of unions, their members like were laid off, they lost their jobs. For example, Unite Here, which represents hotel workers, hospitality workers, I think like, 90% of their membership lost their jobs during COVID, obviously, because a lot of events were shut down, hotels weren't booking. And so a lot of that looked like us pivoting into a COVID support fund for workers and working families. So we distributed more than $100,000 out to folks. And yet I'm like, that's still not enough, right? So like, it's also about continuing that support, like connecting to folks. And I think I actually wanted to lift up Unite Here because they're really amazing and like have this electoral connection where, they still had folks who were out of work late into 2020. So they pivoted into a huge mass mobilizing campaign where they had their members, go to different states like Arizona, Georgia, and knock doors, knowing that like it was a critical election and that like there was a huge gap in that way. And I think it was a great way to like recognize like a lot of union members that folks don't know, like we're so good at one-on-ones. We got those house visits down. Like that conversation that happens always in the workplace translates directly to knocking on the doors and talking to voters. And so Unite Here was super critical to just, flipping the Senate and the presidency and everything. But also like that work still continues today. Like we have a member leader who's right now in Reno, and she's been there for more than a month, just like organizing folks to knock on doors. So I think a lot of it is about how do we kind of, unfortunately, have to stay resilient constantly, but also like, pivot to different ways of, making sure that folks still have some level of economic security. And then also recognizing like, as the world really continue changing, the conversation changed too. Like Black Lives Matter in 2020 really opened the doors for folks to talk about, anti-Asian racism too. Like I always, kind of know that gratitude has to be there just the same way that the Civil Rights Act in the 60s paved the way for the Immigration Act of 1965. And so for us, it's like, saying the things that we've always been saying and now being like, okay, how do we have this conversation in a broader way and not just within our community, because there are more folks who are listening.
Awesome. Well, I don't know, Joy, or if you wanted to add anything as well, or Michael.
Yeah, I think really quickly, the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes was really difficult. It's difficult to watch constant videos of people being attacked. And I think there was a surge in conversation around mental health that I personally haven't seen in our community that I think came out of that. I think electorally in 2020, I think Advancing Justice, AAJC shifted to kind of help community members navigate an election during COVID-19, provided resources and translated resources to kind of help community members do that. I think one thing that Advancing Justice, AAJC has done is to offer with right to be bystander intervention training. But something that I've seen recently are like voter intimidation trainings, which is super unfortunate. That has to be something that is tailored for the Asian community, but that's, I think, something I've seen recently as well.
Yeah, no, I'll add that, it's so important to understand our history, right? And, the idea that, Asians have always been viewed as perpetual foreigners, right? As exotic, and this captured in this idea of like the yellow peril, right? Which refers to this general idea of a fear of mistrust and hatred of Asians. And so, and we have to also recognize that this rise in anti-Asian hate was fueled by not only misinformation about the coronavirus, but also just extreme recklessness from political figures, right? That continue to call the virus Kung Flu or Chinese virus. All right, and so what we try to do at OCA is, like Joy said with AJC, we've also put on trainings for our members, bystander intervention trainings, where we teach people how to be confident and effective bystanders against racism and discrimination, and how to intervene appropriately whenever they experience harassment. The other training that we organized at the beginning of this is this rapid response training, where oftentimes people think that the criminal justice system is the only avenue to address hate crimes, right? But oftentimes the community is in the best position to assist a victim and to address a hate crime. And so during this training, we educate folks on what is a hate crime, what is a hate incident, right? We talk about resources for victims. And then we provide sort of sample cases on how our chapters at the local level have, addressed hate crimes. And so, yeah.
So I want you all to give NextGen, any organization that's really mobilizing voters, right, and mobilizing the community to take action. How can we be a more culturally competent organization in our outreach and connecting with the AAPI community?
Yeah, and I think Joy will have a lot because I know AJC is really great at this. But just some pieces from like kind of our worker side is recognizing that that we're not a single issue community. I think like a lot of times, and some of our work at Apollo is around immigration too, and we always come up against folks who are like, oh, I didn't know that APIs care about immigration. And it's like, yes, we do. But so like a lot of the, I think, culturally competent ways include like, not only like recognizing like what are the things we care about, like, reading into, for example, the Asian American Voter Survey, or including us in polling, or even just like, thinking about like, okay, if these are issues that we're talking about with X community, let's make sure we talk about it with APIs as well. And some of those would be healthcare, immigration, gun control. So those are some of the top issues for AAPIs. But oftentimes I think there's assumptions that like our communities only care about things that are over here, things that are siloed. So that's a big piece. And I think also recognizing like we all hold multiple identities. So again, like I think, it's not just the API part of me that cares about things. It's like the working part of me, the, person who lives in a city, like all these different things that I think often ascribe to, let's say like white voters. It's like white suburban voters, or like, middle class, or this kind of things. Whereas APIs are lumped into, boom, API. That's it. There's just one. So I think there's a lot of ways that like, yes, maybe our community is smaller, but we're like the fastest growing group, and there's so much diversity in there. So yeah, I think just wanted to lift those up, but definitely like Joy can talk a lot more about language and all these other really specific ways that we must be reached out to.
Yeah, I think like what Vivian said, like our community is wide, it is vast, it has multiple groups coming from different experiences and a really different immigration status as well. I think one thing to always keep in mind is just translations, right? If you have resources only in English, there's only a certain type of person that's going to be able to consume those resources. Also, I think of media, right? Like again, my parents don't watch American news. If you are trying to reach, Filipino Americans within the age of 40 to 60, they're not going to be watching any news. They're going to be watching like Filipino news. So even when you like think about media, there are so many different media, just like there are so many different cultures and newspapers, as well as folks that we reach out to. I think those are some of the bigger things that I think of, but also the perspective that we speak to different communities has to be different, right? What speaks to a Vietnamese American family or parent is not going to be the same thing that speaks to like an Indian American family, right? They're really different experiences. Culturally, those families come from potentially different backgrounds, and that approach has to be different. So I think what Vivian said, right, our community is really different. So just reaching out to like an Asian community in Texas or California, like we can't take for advantage that there's a lot of different experience, historical, right? Immigration, being undocumented, being a refugee. What speaks to folks and how they vote and how they participate electorally, of whether or not they even trust the government that they participate in, right? Those are really different experiences. And I think we just kind of have to think about that a little bit more.
I don't really have much to add because Joy, Vivian pretty much covered everything. So
Great. Well, last question for you all. You all do amazing work. How can people support your work?
Yeah, for Apollo, just go to apollo.org. Oh, very simple. It's on my shirt. APIA.org, we have our volunteer opportunities on the homepage, as well as other ways to get involved, not just for elections, but, you know, we're in a big crunch. I was like, 40 days left. Is that the number? So we, yeah, I think would love for more and more folks to support in those ways. But also we have year-round like training opportunities, things like that. So just check out our website, but also we have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Follow us on all of the socials.
Yeah, you can follow Advancing Justice AAJC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. One thing that I can think of for the election, Advancing Justice AAJC, in collaboration with APIA Vote, host the APIA hotline. So we offer assistance, I want to say in 8 languages, including Cantonese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, Urdu, Hindi. So if you have language skills or if you speak English and you want to work on the hotline, I highly encourage you to volunteer with our hotline. That is going to go live next week all the way to election day, every single day. So if you have language skills, if you want to help out and work on the hotline, highly encourage folks to volunteer for that opportunity.
Awesome. And Michael?
Yeah, same here. Go on to our OCA national website. All the volunteer opportunities are there. See if there's a chapter in your state. If there is, consider joining that chapter. All of our chapters are doing sort of amazing work at the local level. And I'll just put in a quick plug. Another big sort of thing that we're working on in the education space is K through 12 curriculum development. So we're working, we've already sort of designed 30 new lesson plans to put into a database, but right now we're in the phase where we're working with certain chapters in certain states where there's pending ethnic studies bills to get a bill passed. And so the focus this year is going to be on advocacy and outreach at that local level to make sure that we get K through 12 curriculum into K through 12 schools.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for taking the time out of your very busy schedule with, yes, just a few weeks away from the election. We're all going to sleep post-November. It's going to be amazing. And thank you for sharing your culture, your insight, and all of the incredibly powerful work you all do. We're really grateful for it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.